standing now near one of the most visited sites on the Ypres salient. You see the train tracks behind me. Well, when those tracks were first laid in the 1850s, the area was cut to provide for those tracks, and so the spoil, the dirt from the cutting of those tracks, was dumped on either side of the tracks, and the spoil on that side became known during the war as Hill 60. The spoil on this side became known as the Caterpillar. We're going to talk a little bit more about both of those, but I want to give you a sense of where we are, because then if you look in this direction, you can actually see the spires of the churches in Ypres itself. So it's a great place to get a real sense of what's happening here. And this is also a place where men from many nations were involved in the fighting over the 4 years of the conflict here on the salient. So let's take a look around. We'll talk a little bit about some of the battles that took place here. We'll talk about the tunneling, the war underground that may have been more vicious here than anywhere on the Western Front. And we'll talk about exactly what happened here. So let's talk about the history of the fighting here. Like most places on the Ypres salient, fighting took place here from the fall of 1914 right up to near the end of the war. Since the hill was 60 meters above sea level, thus the name, it provided a key observation point for artillery spotters, so both sides wanted to take and hold this position. The Germans originally took the hill from the French on December 10, 1914. The British recaptured it on April 17, 1915. But in May of the same year, after a massive attack using large quantities of chlorine gas, the Germans retook it and then quite literally cemented their possession of the hill. But while the fighting continued in the trenches above ground, the real war here was the one below the surface. Here's a perfect illustration of how vicious the fighting was here and how close it was. This tells us this was the French front line in December of 1914, and then of course the British took over the front line here in January 1915. Now take a look right where that man is standing. That's the German front line. Their trenches were dug that close. They could talk to each other. They could lob grenades at each other if they wanted to. But that's how close they were. December 1914. Now we're talking about the German front line. And just up there to that platform is the Allied line. This is the monument to the Queen Victoria's rifles, which was placed here after the Second World War because the original had been destroyed by the Germans. Second Lieutenant Geoffrey Woolley was serving with that battalion in the fighting here on Hill 60 in April of 1915. On the night of the 20th into the 21st of April, he and a handful of men were the only defenders on the hill, and they continually repelled attacks to hold on to this position. Woolley encouraged his men to hold the line against heavy machine gun fire and terrible artillery fire. For a time, he was the only officer on this hill. When he and his men were finally relieved on the morning of April 21st, only 14 men remained out of an original company strength of 150. For his gallantry that night, Woolley was awarded the Victoria Cross, and he became the first man from a territorial unit to receive that honor in the First World War. So just as with every First World War battlefield, you have to use your imagination a little bit because there's all this growth, these trees. None of this would have been here. If you look at pictures from World War I battlefields, by the time you get to 1915, 1916, 1917, you're looking at barren landscapes that look like the moon. You're looking at craters everywhere. All of the trees have been either taken down for use by the military or shattered by extended artillery use. The one thing that is familiar is the mud. It's not real bad today, but it has rained, and so there is some mud, and there's some kind of a shelter there. It was probably used for protection from artillery and mortars. You can see the remnants of it here. This is a really cool way of being able to see what things look like from this perspective at the time. There's this panoramic photo that was taken on the 9th of April, 1915, which is right before the British blew a couple of mines and retook the position. And so you can see here, we're looking toward the Caterpillar, which is right in through those woods. Right there is where the crater is, where the Caterpillar was, and that's what it looked like then. And then of course we have the rail bridge, and then you can see a field grave right here. That's fascinating. That would have been right on the other side of the railroad. You can see the German lines off in the distance. You can see the British lines down here closer. And then over here, of course, would be Hill 60. Really pretty cool. Hill 60 would be right through those trees over there. From 1915 onward, mining and counter-mining was carried out beneath Hill 60 at a terrifying rate. The first mines were dug by the British, who exploded a mine here in February 1915, and several more preceding their capture of the hill in April. There were extensive mining operations by both the British 175th Tunneling Company and the 3rd Canadian Company, but it's the Australians who are most remembered for their work here. When they arrived, the main galleries filled with explosives beneath Hill 60 and Caterpillar were already in place. It was up to the Australians to maintain those tunnels over the next 7 months. They were also responsible for digging ventilation and drainage shafts and for counter-mining operations. The Germans were well aware of what was happening, and so there was a war underground. The Germans would dig shafts trying to locate the Allied mines. The Allies would dig shafts of their own and place explosives, hoping to destroy the German tunnels. Occasionally, there would be breakthroughs, and vicious hand-to-hand combat ensued deep beneath the surface. It was every bit as horrifying as we can imagine. In April of 1917, the German infantry conducted a raid into the British lines in an attempt to find the entrances to the mine galleries, but they failed to do so. On the 25th of April 1917, a detonator exploded in the Australian underground headquarters, which killed 10 men. The official Australian history states that at Hill 60, quote, underground warfare reached a tension that was not surpassed anywhere else on the British front, end quote. It's estimated that altogether there were 30 Australian tunnellers who were killed here at Hill 60. Behind me is one of the most prominent memorials anywhere at this site, and it's to the men of the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company for the incredible work and the incredible sacrifice that they experienced here at Hill 60. The mines under Hill 60 and here under the Caterpillar were part of a network of 21 mines that were filled with around 1 million pounds of explosives along this part of the salient. The opening of what became known as the Battle of Messines was at that time the largest and loudest man-made explosion in history. Over a period of several minutes, beginning at around 3:10 a.m. on June 7, 1917, the British simultaneously blew up 19 mines in the opening move of the Messines attack. They didn't realize it at the time, but 2 of the mines failed to detonate, and to this day, those mines lie beneath the surface, packed with tens of thousands of pounds of explosives. The Hill 60 mine crater was 60 feet deep and 280 feet wide. The German frontline troops were overwhelmed. 10,000 of them were killed in the explosions alone. After the explosions, and preceded by a creeping artillery barrage, Australian, New Zealand, and British troops advanced to find a shattered enemy. An official war historian, Charles Bean, wrote, "Everywhere, after firing a few scattered shots, the Germans surrendered as the troops approached. Men went along the trenches, bombing the shelters whose occupants then came out, some of them cringing like beaten animals. A Lieutenant Gerard reported that the Germans, quote, made many fruitless attempts to embrace us. I have never seen men so demoralized." When you're at Hill 60, you can't really get a sense of the size of the mine craters. First of all, there were multiple mines that hit there. There's a lot of artillery shells that have created craters. And there's also a lot of growth from trees and plants and things like that. So it's difficult to get a sense of the size and the scale of some of the bombs that were exploded there. But here at the Caterpillar, you can definitely do that because it's got one big crater from that big attack that happened during the Battle for Messines Ridge. And so it's a great place to come and get a little more of a sense of it. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's going to translate well onto video. It often doesn't. I've seen video of this crater before. And just like the crater at Hawthorne Ridge over at the Somme, you have to see it in person to really understand just how big it is. Just to understand just how devastating this would have been when it exploded under the feet of these German soldiers. So this is now standing in one of the craters for Hill 60. Hill 60 obviously is not very tall anymore. Most of it was blown to smithereens by the various explosives that were used here throughout the 4 years of the war. But you can at least get a little sense of the crater here. And you can see craters inside of craters, which are, just artillery strikes that happened here. And it's just that reminder that it wasn't just one time or a few times that fighting was happening here. Everywhere you go in the Ypres salient, it's 4 years of conflict. It's battle on top of battle on top of battle. And it's also important to remember that anytime you stand in one of these craters like this, it's almost certain to be a war grave. There are men who were obliterated by the explosion or buried beneath the debris, who were never recovered and who lay beneath the grass here today. This bunker is one of the most fascinating parts of the battlefield here. This was originally a German shelter. It was behind the German lines. The Germans held this position for a couple of years. It was eventually taken by the Australians, who converted it into the bunker that you see today. And that's what was used by the Australians. But the Great War was not the end of the fighting here. On May 27th, 1940, there was fighting here during the Second World War, and there's actually damage to this bunker that was caused by the explosives used during that battle in the Second World War. Right near the tracks between Hill 60 and the Caterpillar is this memorial, which has nothing to do with the First World War, but has everything to do with the Second. These photographs in this memorial are to two French resistance fighters. They were near Lille at a train station when there was a raid by the SS, and they were captured. They were on the train which was brought here toward the town of Ypres. And so we really don't know for sure exactly what happened, but the likely scenario is that the train had stopped here while waiting for an additional engine to come to pull it the rest of the way. And while they were stopped here, the members of the German army executed the two French resistance members, dumped their bodies off the train, and they were found here the next morning. Residents had heard the gunshots. They were found by a couple of young people here, and they were temporarily buried in town until they could be repatriated back to France.